boarding school to which the father sent his daughters, the clergy daughters' school in Cowanbridge, tried to prepare them for the only career open to them, that of teacher or governess. At the school, humiliation, hunger, cold and illness were nothing unusual. Indeed, they represented some of the educational methods of this extremely pious and cheap institution. Charlotte described her traumatic experiences in this prison of a school later in Jane Eyre. The Reverend Carus Wilson, the founder and principal of the school, had a very individual concept of loving thy neighbors as thyself. In his book, The Children's Friend, he recommends the following: break the child's will if you do not wish to abandon it to eternal damnation. When the child is a year old, teach it to fear the rod and to weep quietly. As a sad result of this educational system, Maria and Elizabeth, the two eldest daughters, died in their first year at school, undernourished, worn out and exhausted. Reverend Bronte took Emily and Charlotte away from the school and decided to teach them himself. A few happy years followed, during which the young Brontes' freedom in the familiar surroundings of their home knew no bounds, as their unconventional father allowed them to do everything he himself thought was right and appropriate.
The kitchen was always the centre of the Bronte household, partly because it was one of the warmest places in the house, and with stone floors that we have here, it would be a very cold house, particularly in winter, but partly because this was Tabby's domain. Tabby Ackroyd, the old Bronte servant, who looked after them for nearly 30 years. Tabby was a person from the village. She was full of stories and folklore, and she would entrance the children, who would sit round the fire and listen to her tales of ghosts and folk stories and fairies and all the amazing stories that were associated with this place. But it was also in the kitchen in the dark winter nights when the children would gather round the fire and it was too dark to be able to write, and they would sit here and they would invent their stories. They would invent magic kingdoms. They would decide on who would have a particular island and who would people that island. And these stories were the very germs of the juvenilia, and it was out of this juvenilia, this childhood writing, that all the later novels would grow.
On the night of June the 5th, 1826, a year after Maria and Elizabeth died, the Reverend Patrick Bronte, returning from Leeds, placed beside the bed of 9-year-old Branwell a box from the soldiers. The next morning, Branwell was at his sister's door, calling them to see his new soldiers. Out of bed jumped Charlotte, Emily and Anne, Charlotte in the lead. Snatching up one of the soldiers, the tallest and handsomest of the lot, Charlotte exclaimed, "This is the Duke of Wellington. This shall be Duke." Then Emily picked out for herself a serious-looking fellow. "This is a grave-looking fellow. I shall call him Gravy." Next was Anne. "I shall call mine Waiting Boy." Then Branwell. "I shall call this one Napoleon Bonaparte." Through these soldiers the children had many an adventure.
These romantic heroes of their childhood remained in the imagination of the brother and sisters forevermore. The girls succeeded in developing them further in the characters of their later novels. Their brother did not. Branwell, the charming, lively, red-headed boy, was, according to Mrs. Gaskell, full of noble impulses as well as of extraordinary gifts. His sisters tried to blind themselves by love to the fact that Branwell was worse than other young men. Worse because he drank, took opium, and was dismissed for culpable negligence. In brief, he didn't meet the hopes and expectations of the family in any way. Branwell's features are blurred, as he was not satisfied with his portrait in the family group and covered it up as well as he could. Later biographers saw this as an act of self-destruction.
Branwell was an important part of the Bronte family. From childhood, he was the leader and innovator in all their childhood games. As the only boy, he was the one who was expected to earn a living and keep his sisters. So there was always that sort of pressure on him. But he was a man of many talents. He could not only write and think and talk superbly, but he was also a good painter. In the portrait that we see behind me, he actually portrayed his three sisters and himself between the figures of Emily and Charlotte. He later painted himself out, not from any sort of psychological reasons, but because the picture was too crowded. It's interesting that we have a lost image there of Branwell Bronte. He was a very talented person in many directions, and his problem was that he really didn't know which way he wanted to go. But without him, there would have been no Bronte sisters.
At 18, the promising artist Branwell went to London to study art at the Royal Academy. His pictures showed definite signs of talent, and his art teacher had convinced his father and his aunt that he would, in the future, be able to earn a good income as a portrait painter. However, the prodigal son returned to Haworth very soon, without having really tried to gain a foothold in the capital. He had wasted the money in pubs. Once he was home, he got over this defeat very quickly and decided to make his living by writing. He published his poems regularly in the Leeds Mercury and waited for a proper job to turn up. Nor was he impatient, as the pub, the Black Bull, was right next to the church, and the clergyman's son would spawn gin there if he was short of money. His sisters were blind to all this. For them he remained the pampered darling.
There has been the suggestion that Emily Bronte and Branwell, her brother, had an incestuous relationship. There's even been a suggestion that Emily had an incestuous relationship with her father. But I think that this is really desperate literary critics of the 20th century trying to find the reason why Emily could create such figures as Heathcliff and Hareton and the other Earnshaw men in her novel Wuthering Heights. The fact is that there is no contemporary evidence whatsoever to suggest that even that Emily was closer to Branwell than to her sisters, for instance. It is purely and simply later interpretation of the novels rather than contemporary evidence that suggests this.
Heathcliff loves his foster sister, Cathy Earnshaw, and she loves him. But how can they ever come together? He, the foundling, probably of gypsy origin, and she, the wealthy landowner's daughter. When old Mr. Earnshaw, his patron, dies, Heathcliff no longer has a protector. He is exposed to the cruel humiliations imposed on him by Cathy's brother. He leaves the house where he has lived since Earnshaw brought him there as a small child, and successfully seeks his fortune in the world outside. While he is away, Cathy marries Edgar Linton, who is both gentle and wealthy, but when Heathcliff returns, their love flares up again. This is the stormiest love story in Victorian literature, love as an abyss, as an elemental force which even death cannot affect. This was Emily's great novel, and her only one, probably based on some of the wild ghost stories told to her by their old servant Tabby. The novel aroused emotions, repelled contemporary readers, and was not recognized as a classic of English literature until a generation later.
My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nelly, I am Heathcliff. He is always, always in my mind. Not as a pleasure, any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. So don't talk of our separation again. It is impracticable.